It is March 1999 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A woman named Cynthia Vigil is abducted from a parking lot, driven deep into the desert and padlocked inside a trailer. A metal slave collar is forced around her neck. There are upside-down crucifixes on the walls and guides detailing how to handle a kidnapped victim. Her captors are a mysterious man who claims to be a police officer and a woman who follows his every order. They force her to listen to a tape.
Hello there. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you. You are obviously here against your will. You're going to be kept chained in a variety of different positions, usually with your legs or knees forced wide apart. You will be thoroughly and repeatedly in every hole you've got.
This is the story of David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, and the women who brought him to justice. Over the next 3 days, the man keeps his word. Cynthia is tortured, beaten with whips, and her skin is slashed open. The torture leaves her with permanent nerve damage. But when she realizes the man enjoys her pain, she starts subduing her reactions and makes a crucial choice. She isn't going to die knowing she gave in. She wasn't going to be the weak one. Little did she know of the ramifications that this decision would have. One day, the man goes to work and leaves his accomplice, the woman, in charge. But the woman makes a mistake. She takes a phone call in the back of the trailer, leaving the keys to Cynthia's padlock on a nearby table. Cynthia lost her mother to a murder at age 14 in mysterious circumstances and is determined to escape the same fate. Grabbing the keys, she starts testing each one on the lock. One by one, they fail, and when the mysterious woman comes back, a fight breaks out. Cynthia is struck over the head with a lamp, but in the frenzied situation, she manages to open the lock, stab the woman in the head with an ice pick, and flee into the desert. Cynthia is naked, drenched in blood, with the slave collar around her neck, but she is free. She has escaped. And her daring escape bears more fruit than anyone could imagine, as it leads authorities to discover something far bigger and more disturbing than kidnapping. Following Cynthia's escape, the police detain the man David Parker Ray, the woman Cindy Hendy, and 2 more accomplices, Parker Ray's daughter Glenda Jessie Jean Ray and his friend Dennis Yancey. The police obtain a search warrant for Parker Ray's house in Elephant Butte, south of Albuquerque, and discover where Cynthia had been held and uncover multiple torture devices. Her story has now been corroborated. But when they search outside and find an unassuming white trailer, they realize the extent of the horror they're dealing with. The white trailer, nicknamed the Toy Box, was built for one purpose: bodily torture. Inside, the police find custom-made torture tools lining the walls, as well as videotapes Parker Ray had made of his crimes and audio recordings used to orientate his victims. There was evidence that dozens of women had been kidnapped and tortured, possibly even murdered. But how did this happen? How long had this been going on? And who was David Parker Ray? To understand, we must go back to 1939. The future toy box killer, David Parker Ray, was born on November 6, 1939. He grew up on a small ranch in New Mexico with authoritarian grandparents and was occasionally visited by his father. The father was an alcoholic and physically abusive man who beat David and supplied him with sadomasochistic adult magazines, nursing what would later grow into chilling fantasies. David's school life wasn't much better. Socially awkward around girls, he was regularly teased and bullied for his shyness, and around this time, David began to abuse drugs and alcohol, and his fantasies of raping, torturing, and murdering women began. Initially, this took the outlet of violent, sadomasochistic images which he drew and images of bondage which he collected. When he was 14, his sister discovered these images and was so shocked by what she saw that they drifted apart. But his perverse and violent interests continued to develop. By his own words, he began committing sexual assaults as a teenager. He even claimed that in 1957 he tied a woman to a tree and tortured and murdered her. David would have only been a teenager at the time, but this was never verified. Was he born this way? Had the influence of his father shaped the course of his life? Or was it both? Whatever the answer, David was not alone in his violent interests, as a fateful encounter in 1997 would prove. In the bizarrely named town Truth or Consequences, David was working as a New Mexico Parks maintenance man. It was here that he met his first accomplice, the 37-year-old Cindy Jean Hendy, who had existing convictions for grand theft and drug charges. They were made for each other. The two fell in love for the usual reasons, common interests, which in their case were violent fantasies. These fantasies intensified throughout David's life. In particular, he had been fascinated by sexually motivated kidnappings, like the case of Colleen Stan.
Back to 1977, when at 20 years old, Colleen accepted a ride from a couple with a baby. That ride turned into a decade of torture, slavery, and terror.
I was tortured until I would black out.
She described how he led her to his basement, where torture devices waited. How he used her as a canvas for his sadism for 7 years, often keeping her in a compartment under his bed.
Now with Cindy Hendy at his side, he had someone who shared his appreciation for crimes like this, but Cindy wasn't his only accomplice. His daughter, Glenda Jessie Jean Ray, from a previous marriage, would prove instrumental in helping him capture his victims and would be a key player in some of his more notable abductions. Although this father-daughter relationship was extremely abnormal, actions David would take later in life when he was on trial suggested a certain amount of paternal care. Now that he was established, David set to work creating his very own torture chamber. Inside, there were numerous adult toys which had been customized to barbaric size, with some even fitted with nails so they would cause as much pain to the victim as possible. There were detailed diagrams instructing the reader on how to torture a victim, a generator purpose-built for electrocution, needles and syringes, whips, pulleys, chains, clamps, leg spreader bars so extreme they would dislocate the victim's hips, locks to prevent escape, surgical blades, a fur-lined coffin, and in the middle, an obstetric table onto which David would tie his victims, above which he positioned a mirror so they could witness themselves being tortured and physically abused. The entire setup was so extensive that Parker Ray is believed to have spent $100,000 on it. Yet all of this equipment was made worse by David's particularly disturbing methods. With the help of Cindy Hendy and his daughter Jessie Jean Ray, David abducted women from local bars in Truth or Consequences. David was prolific, abducting 4 or 5 women per year. He would hold each one for 2 to 3 months, heavily drugging them with barbiturates and subjecting them to hypnosis while he carried out his heinous crimes. His partner Cindy Hendy also took part. For each of his victims, David would orientate them to their situation with an audio recording.
You're going to be tied in a variety of different positions, but for the most part, you'll be kept on a rectangular table, chained down, spread-eagled. And in a week or two, when I'm through with you, you can be turned loose.
When he was finished, he would drug them in order to induce amnesia and abandon them by the side of the road. Some of his victims may have also been murdered, something later attested to by David's accomplices. In 1986, events transpired that might have led to his capture. David's daughter, Jessie Jean Ray, perhaps out of fear or guilt, contacted the FBI, warning them that her father was kidnapping, torturing, and selling women to buyers in Mexico. But her claims were considered non-specific and no action was taken. In 1989, the FBI spoke to him again regarding his manufacture of bondage devices. But Parker Ray still remained free and many lives may have been saved if only the authorities had investigated him further. It wasn't until Cynthia Vigil's daring escape in March 1999 that he was finally apprehended. And this was when many of his confirmed suspected victims came to light. When Cynthia's chilling story became known, a woman named Angelica Montano came forward. She had been invited to Parker Ray's house by his partner, Cindy Hendy, under the pretense of picking up a cake mix, but when she arrived, what she encountered was far worse. She was captured and subjected to rape and torture until she was dumped on the side of the highway. An off-duty police officer discovered Angelica, but when she explained what happened, he didn't believe her and abandoned her at a bus station. Later, Angelica would call the police again, desperate for help, but no immediate action would be taken. But in 1999, when Cynthia Vigil escaped and David Parker Ray's operation was discovered, the dark truth about Angelica's story would come to light. During the police's search of David Parker Ray's property, they discovered the identity of another victim, miraculously from one of his videotapes. Kelly Garrett had gone on a night out with her friends after a fight with her husband when she suddenly disappeared. She'd been last seen with Jessie Jean Ray, David's daughter and unassuming accomplice. 2 days later, acting like a good Samaritan, he dropped Kelly Garrett off at home, telling her husband that he had found her confused on a beach.
I don't remember getting out of the truck. I remember sitting on my in-laws' front porch. My hair was a mess, I had sand everywhere, I was still in the same clothes I was in the day I left.
Garrett had no recollection of where she'd been or what had happened, and her husband did not believe her and soon filed for divorce. Because she did not know any of the details of what had transpired or where she had been, she did not contact the police. After all, what could she say? But while that could have been the end of her story, there was more. On Parker Ray's videotapes, the FBI found chilling footage that contained a woman with a unique tattoo, a tattoo which identified her as Kelly Garrett. And the unsettling truth of what had occurred over those 2 missing days was revealed. She had been drugged and tortured. These 3 women, 3 survivors, Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and Kelly Garrett, would later be instrumental in sentencing David. Among his other confirmed victims was 22-year-old Sylvia Marie Parker. She lived in a tent with her 2 children on the shores of Elephant Butte Lake. She was friends with Parker Ray's daughter and had even borrowed the tent from the man himself. Her boyfriend, Dennis Yancey, was also a friend of Ray's. On July 5th, 1997, she vanished without a trace. It was not until much later that her fate would be revealed. Sylvia Marie Parker had been abducted, tortured, and then murdered. The killer was her boyfriend, Dennis Yancey, one of Parker Ray's playmates. Dennis strangled her to death on Parker Ray's orders, and her body was disposed of in the New Mexico desert.
I know they ended up giving me a rope and telling me to strangle her, and she wasn't dying fast enough.
Okay, but you said she wasn't dying fast enough. Was she struggling, or?
Yeah, she was struggling.
Later, when Yancey revealed to investigators what he'd done, he led them to where her remains were, except they were gone. Both he and the investigators suspected that Parker Ray had moved her remains, possibly so Yancey could never have a change of heart and reveal her body to investigators. But alongside Sylvia, there are more suspected victims. On September the 25th, 1988, Billy Ray Bowers disappeared. He was the co-owner of a used car business which employed David Parker Ray. Although he was a talented employee, the two did not see eye to eye. A year later in 1989, Bowers' body was discovered in Elephant Butte Lake. He had no ID on him, but dental records confirmed his identity. Billy had been shot in the back of the head. On September 30th, 1995, a 22-year-old woman named Jill Suzanne Troyer vanished from Albuquerque, New Mexico. According to witnesses, she was last seen arguing with Jessie Jean Ray. Later, the police would find David Parker Ray's diary, which detailed his crimes. A section even described the appearance of an Asian woman that matched Jill's. Sadly, to this day, her body has never been found. Alongside the diary was a 2-page letter dated June 1990. It was addressed to a woman named Connie from an Australian man named Mark. On its own, this wouldn't amount to much. But when combined with David's diary, the implications became more unsettling. His diary described a white woman 160 centimeters tall with long blonde hair and a birthmark on her chest. She was named Connie. Parker claims to have murdered her in 1995.
Frank Fisher with the FBI was on Australian TV earlier today asking for the public's cooperation in finding the man who wrote this letter.
The Australian Federal Police, alongside the FBI, were never able to locate Mark, the man who sent the original letter. They even have various details such as his 1990 address in New South Wales, as well as information about his life and movements, but nobody has ever come forward, and to this day, Connie has never been identified, and her remains have never been found. Another suspected victim was found in 1999, again in Elephant Butte Lake, when a man fished up an 80-pound sack filled with some kind of meat. At first he thought it was animal, but it was soon discovered to be human flesh. Whoever it was had been dismembered before being placed inside the sack. This is not inconsistent with David Parker Ray's methods, as he was alleged to have said that when disposing of a victim in a lake, you need to scoop out their guts, fill their chest cavity with cement weights, and tie them up with wire. In 2000, following his arrest and the women's stories, David Parker Ray was brought before the court. He would face the judge, the jury, and the 3 women who had survived him. Cynthia Vigil, who had escaped and led the authorities to arrest him, Angelica Montano, who had been abandoned on the side of the highway and ignored by the police, and Kelly Garrett, who had been identified by her unique tattoo. Each of the women's experiences corroborated the other. Their kidnapping, David's method of torture, both physical and psychological, as well as the behavior and involvement of his associates. On paper, it seemed like a clear-cut case, but life is rarely that simple. The judge made two decisive rulings. The first was that each case must be tried separately, meaning that each of the women's near identical experiences could not be used as corroborating evidence. The second was that Parker Ray's audio tape was inadmissible for both Montano and Garrett. This was crucial, as in the tape he detailed his plans for torturing his victims against their will and the pleasure he gained from it. This was clear evidence that nothing was consensual. The impact of these rulings was immediately felt. In his trial for crimes against Kelly Garrett, Parker Ray defended himself by claiming that everything was consensual and that the trailer was part of his erotic fantasy life. Despite her account saying the opposite, two jurors disbelieved her, and it ended in a mistrial. Fortunately, in retrial, video of Kelly's torture as well as the audio tapes were played, and this time the verdict was damning. Parker Ray was convicted on all 12 accounts. Afterwards, he made a cynical comment to the local news, lamenting the jury's decision.
I feel raped.
Angelica Montano's case wasn't so lucky. On May 7th, she sadly died of pneumonia at the age of only 25. David Parker Ray's abuse had left more than just physical scars, and she had fallen into a life of drug addiction. With her death, the trial for his crimes against her became uncertain. But a few days later, he would face Cynthia Vigil, the woman whose daring escape had led to his capture. At Ray's trial against Cynthia, he continued to profess his innocence, and even appeared to have a smug, in-control demeanor. As she stood before him, forced to go over her terrible ordeal before the court, she remembered how Ray had gotten off on her pain. She could see that he was enjoying this just the same. He still considered her his victim, but as before, when she was captive, she had other plans. Turning to look him in the eye, she said,
"I'm not your victim, you're my victim now." I noticed his demeanor changed, and I was able to let go of a lot.
The evidence was beginning to stack against him. Videotapes, a detailed diary of his crimes, the audio recording, they were all testament to what he'd done, and his skill of installing complex engineering devices demonstrated his lack of insanity. The approaching verdict was clear, but how he reacted was surprising. A week into his trial against Cynthia, Ray made a plea bargain for 224 years of imprisonment for his crimes. His condition, leniency for his daughter and accomplice, Glenda Jessie Jean Ray. He claimed, "I can only be sorry for what I did." The surviving victims approved the deal, and Glenda Jessie Jean Ray received a 30-month sentence and 5 years of probation for kidnapping and criminal penetration. Today, her whereabouts are unknown. Cindy Hendy, Parker Ray's girlfriend and accomplice, and the woman that Cynthia overpowered with the ice pick, actually testified against David. She received a sentence of 36 years in prison, but not before Cynthia rose and told her to rot in hell. She was released in 2019. As for David Yancey, the playmate who murdered his girlfriend Sylvia Marie Parker on David's orders, he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. During his trial, he claimed that both Parker Ray and his daughter were involved in the murder, but investigators could find no evidence to corroborate this. It is thought that over the course of his life, David Parker Ray had raped, tortured, and murdered up to 60 people, perhaps even more. His girlfriend, Cindy Jean Hendy, who testified against him, claimed that he dismembered and buried his murder victims in desert ravines or dumped them in Elephant Butte Lake. Searches of the lake were made, but nothing was ever found. Authorities even considered draining the lake, but this idea was ruled out because it would be too costly. The only hope of finding and identifying the bodies lay with the killer himself, but would he help them? Well, after his arrest, he did agree to lead the authorities to where he disposed of the bodies, but whether he would have made good on this or not, no one will ever know, because David died of a heart attack before state police could interrogate him and took the locations to the grave.
They think he may have killed dozens and dozens of women, but for 15 years, investigators have failed to find a single body. Now, the state cop who was in charge of unraveling David Parker Ray's chilling past is speaking out.
In 2011, the Albuquerque FBI attempted to rejuvenate interest in the case in the hopes of identifying missing persons who may have been connected with Parker Ray. They released hundreds of images of items such as jewelry, watches, and clothing. The toy box itself was even open to the public, but the investigation lost steam. His many suspected murders remain unidentified and unsolved. their families never to receive closure. But one woman in this story, Cynthia Vigil, would receive a different kind of closure. After David Parker Ray's trial and death, Cynthia rebuilt her life, engaged in volunteering, and kept an eye on murders that were happening within New Mexico. When bone fragments were discovered in the West Mesa, all belonging to women in the sex trade, women who Cynthia herself had met, she decided something had to be done. In 2011, she was approached by a fellow volunteer and author, Christine Barber, and founded Safe Street New Mexico, a charity that helps sex workers and vulnerable people living on the street, providing help that she and her mother never received. Years before, Cynthia's own mother had been killed under mysterious circumstances. That same murder had given her the courage and drive to escape from David Parker Ray. But years later in 2020, the mysterious circumstances of her mother's death were about to be solved.
The FBI says Samuel Little confessed to murdering one of his 90 victims right here in the metro. Little says he killed a, quote, 25-year-old white woman in Albuquerque.
Samuel Little, a serial killer of over 60 victims, had confessed to the killing. Her killer had been found. But once again, like Parker Ray, authorities had been warned about him prior to the murder. Cynthia's life had been marked by 2 encounters with serial killers, 2 murderers that could and should have been stopped beforehand, as who knows how many lives could have been saved.